We're continuing in uh, Hebrews 10. And, when we went through, it was like 4 years ago when we were doing Hebrews on like a Wednesday night teaching. Of course, then it was like an hour and 20 minutes per time. But we're, not going through at the same pace. We're slowing down, looking a little more closely. And yet in the midst of looking closely, what we don't want to do is lose sight of the bigger picture. A lot of times when people look at Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, they really can get bogged down get bogged down in the theological, all the deep theological stuff that's there. And when I say that, I'm not meaning to diminish that. It's all important. The writer of Hebrews is bringing that stuff to the forefront, but he's bringing it to the forefront within the context of the real life of walking out your faith, of holding on to what is true, of holding on to what God has spoken, of not growing weary in the midst of the battle. And so we hit these dense theological areas that are critically important, and yet the intention is to exhort us, to remind us of what God has spoken. And as we come through verses 11 through 18, it really becomes the closing section of this portion, basically. Chapter 8, verse 1 through 10:18 is considered to be like one segment of thought that continues, and then verse 19 opens up with the therefore. It now becomes the word of what do we do with that, and what's the practical application? How do we approach this? You have in the first century here. It's the late 60s of the first century. You have believers that are weary, and that are persecuted, that are suffering, that think, and we can see from other, what believers experienced to some degree from others like Peter, who people are growing weary. They're wondering what's taking so long. And it's one thing to look at it, to see that the long waiting when you look back at someone else's experience and be like, yeah, that was a long time. It's another thing when you're in the midst of it, right? When you're in the midst of actual pain, time doesn't fly when you're in the midst of pain. It feels like it slows down. Things feel like they take longer. I remember when several years ago, I was having my gallbladder would inflame if I ever drank coffee. I had to go over a year without drinking coffee. It was terrible. But whenever it would happen, it would usually hit me at like 1 a.m, and it would intensify through the night, and I couldn't sleep at all. And it would usually turn off. The pain would subside around 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning. They were the longest nights, and there was no escape from it. And just those 8 hours were just misery. And when I look back, I can go, well, that was really long. But in the midst of it, it's felt especially long. Well, these believers were facing something that felt especially long and especially discouraging. And in the midst of that, it's easy to go, is there some quick way to make the pain go away? And the temptation was to just go back to what was comfortable, go back to what at least, to what's familiar. Because if you're facing pressure from outside, from the Roman Empire, and you're facing pressure from within, they're looking to alleviate some pressure. And so the writer of Hebrews is saying, listen, God has spoken to us. And we need to remember what he's spoken to us, and we need to hold on to that word, and we need to declare it we need to repeat it. We need to give the full utterance, the full word that he has spoken. He's spoken to us through his Son. And so then within that context, remembering what God has spoken and remembering, and then, at the end of Hebrews chapter 6, where he says, listen, there are these two things that are unchangeable. They are unchanging. Is number one, is the character of God's purposes. God's purposes are unchanging. So when you're in the midst of an aspect of the overall strategy and you can't see the big picture, hold firm to the fact that he will do that his purposes are unchanging. He isn't making this up as he goes. And the second thing that's unchanging is the fact that he does not lie. And so what he said he will do. So on those two things, let those two things be an anchor for your soul that keep you from drifting away, that keep you from standing away from him. And so he's reminding, he's pointing us to Yeshua. He's pointing, why would you go back to the old? Why would you go back to this? And so he begins to, we looked at yesterday, to kind of hold up the two things side by side. As he's reiterating, as he's bringing this section to a close, and he's saying, so you could go backward. Here's your two options. You can go backward. You can drift away, begin to stand away, and fall away toward what? On the one hand, on the other hand, kind of like Fiddler on the Roof. On this hand, on the other hand, going back and forth. You can go backward to that which is a replica. Right? This is a model. This is the sacrificial system. He says is a parable. The tent is a parable. It's pointing toward the true. You can go toward the replica, or you can go toward that which is actual. The high priest and the priests that serve, that you're wanting to go back toward this, well, they're serving in a replica. They're serving and they're doing it continually. Whereas we have such a high priest that he is in the true tent. He is actually seated at the right hand of the majesty in heavens. That he has gone into the actual holy, the holy place, the throne room of God. That's where he is. This is a replica of that. And in the same way that a model car can't get you anywhere, it just gives you a picture of what can get you somewhere. In the same way, this replica, this model is what God was showing us, he was teaching us, reminding us of sin, reminding us of what we need, pointing toward what he would do. But the sacrifices offered there, they were the blood being sprinkled on the replicas. Well, that which was happening in the actual throne room required a greater sacrifice. And so we have the one who is in the true tent. So why would you go back to this? I can tell you, I know I'm going to jump into the text today, but I can tell you that, in the nearly 10 years that, 10 years that we've been leading this congregation, and one of the struggles, especially early on, is and in the years preceding that, one of the things that we see sometimes within the Messianic movement has been a tendency, in the face of, for all kinds of reasons, has the tendency of some to want to go backward, where they begin to drift away from Yeshua. And they begin to stand away from Yeshua, and they begin to cling to that which is unable to cleanse sin. They begin to lock into all this stuff, which is a replica, which is pointing us to Yeshua. And we're not to cling to the parable, we're to cling to the actual. And the tendency or the temptation to go backward, it's there. It can relieve pressure. It can feel a little bit easier, and so the Lord wants to remind us to not take our eyes off Yeshua, to not go away from what he's called us to do. He says, on this side, you've got sacrifices that can't actually cleanse the inner man, right? They have never had the ability to cleanse the inner man. But here, he quotes from Psalm 40 saying, look, we've always known that the sacrifices can't cleanse the inner man. In Psalm 40 and also in Psalm 51, he goes, if sacrifice, if burnt offering, if that's what you wanted, I would give it. But what you desire, right? You desire something else. What you desire is the inmost place. What you desire is the depth of me. That's what God wills. That's what God's desire is. That's what he wants. And so what's happened is the old has been, he says, we looked at yesterday, has been, he uses the word done away with, but it's kind of lifted away, as in it has the picture of being crucified in one sense, to make way for the new. It's always been about the transformation of the heart. We can't get focused, hung up on all the little stuff and lose sight of what God actually wants to do in our hearts. We can get all of these little things down. We can have all of this theological stuff down, but if there's not a transformation that's happening in the depth of me, what's going on? So I'm just going to read kind of a retranslation of yesterday's verse. It says, "For the law has a shadow of the good things to come, not the form of itself of things. Each year, the same sacrifices that were offered continually were never able to make perfect, to make complete the ones drawing near. Since wouldn't they have ceased to be offered because the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had a sinful conscience? But in these old sacrifices is a reminder of sins each year. The blood of bulls and goats was not able to have the power to take away sins. Therefore, coming into the world, he says, quoting Psalm 40, sacrifice and offerings you did not desire. That's not what you wanted, but a body prepared for me. And whole offerings concerning sins did not please you. And then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written concerning me for the doing, O God, of your will, of your desire." Now the writer of Hebrews goes back to says, okay, when the psalmist wrote this, the above was said, sacrifices and offerings, and also whole offerings concerning sins you didn't desire, nor did they please you, which were offered according to the law. Then he said, behold, I have come to do your desire, to do what your will is, to do what pleases you. And the writer of Hebrews says, so he lifts away the first in order that the second might be established, what God truly desires. In this will, right? In this, his will, which is his will, we have been made holy through the offering of the body of Messiah Yeshua once and for all. So he continues to hold up the contrast here in verse 11, reiterating the point. He says, look, indeed. And actually, it doesn't say indeed. It uses, it says and it says men day. It says on the one hand, so he's saying on the one hand again. So he goes, so yes, on the one hand, every priest, every Cohen stands according to the day after day, serving and offering the same sacrifices again and again, repeatedly, which can never take away sins. So you have the contrast that he's making here. Okay, let's go back. Let's look at the Levitical priests, right? They didn't sit down in the sanctuary. And that's important. It says every priest stands each day, serving and offering the same repeated sacrifices, right? So they remain standing because the work isn't done. It's repeated. It's happening over and over. Back in verse 1, he pointed to the yearly sacrifices, the Day of Atonement. He says year according to the year. Here he says according to the day. So whether it's the annual sacrifice of the Day of Atonement or it's the daily sacrifices being offered, either way, the repetition was necessary. But not one of these couldn't actually remove sin. They couldn't actually cleanse from sin in the depth of your being with a permanent effect. The completion of one sacrifice over here. When you're done, it doesn't mean you're all done. It's going to have to be offered again tomorrow, and the Day of Atonement sacrifices are going to have to offered again next year, indefinitely, right? It was in keeping with the priests of the old order that they never, for this reason, they never sat down in the presence of God when a sacrifice has been presented to him. So he says, but on the other hand, verse 12, when this one offered for all time, and it uses the word, it's a combo word of dia and pharaoh, like carrying through, bringing through. For he offered the follow through, the carry through, like continually. He offered for all time a single sacrifice, or just a sacrifice for sins. He sat down at the right hand of God. So there's a contrast. These are standing, continually serving, continual sacrifices in the replica. He has gone into the true tent, having made the one sacrifice a better sacrifice, and he is seated at the right hand of the Father. He sat down because the work was completed. Again, we've seen multiple places now in Hebrews where it talks about how he has sat down. We saw at the very beginning, right from the beginning of the book. This was in the opening verses in verse 3 of chapter 1, speaking of the Son, through whom God has spoken to us, who says, who existing as the radiance, as the brilliance, as the emanation of the glory, as the exact representation of his existence, he upholds everything by the power of his utterance. Having made purification of sins, he sits on the right hand of the majesty in the heights. And then in Hebrews 8:1, after having compared the Levitical priesthood to the eternal priesthood in the order of Melchizedek, he says, but the chief point concerning the things being spoken is this: we have this kind of high priest who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in the heavens. Right? A seated priest. A seated priest is a picture of the finished work and an accepted sacrifice. So that the heavenly high priest, we have this kind of high priest that has gone into, right? He has gone into the tent, the true tent. And we eagerly await his emergence. But here's the thing, that the sacrifice that it was done, the once and for all sacrifice which was done before us, he has now gone in. And while he has sat down because the work of the sacrifice is done, unlike he had said, he pointed this out back in Hebrews 7, unlike the priests of the Levitical order, that each one dies and someone else takes their place. Unlike them, he lives continually. And so as it's not that he has stopped working. The sacrifice has been done, but now he lives continually, making intercession for us on the basis of that sacrifice. Hebrews 7:25 says, therefore he is also to save completely. To save to whole fullness is the picture. This word completely, the word perfection, the word it's the word that teleos that we see throughout here, having to do with something coming to its fruition, to its goal. What is it that God really wants to do? He is able to save us completely. So one of the images we've had throughout the book, and he really reiterated it or pointed it out in Hebrews 3 and 4, is this picture of our fathers who were saved out of Egypt with signs and wonders. And the Lord led them through the desert, and they were so close. They were right on the edge. And yet they continued to fail to trust in what God had said over and over and over again. And they died in the desert. Their corpses dropped in the desert. They didn't finish the salvation process. They were saved, but they didn't enter into his rest, it talks about in Hebrews 4, because they had an evil heart of unbelief. They stopped trusting what he says. So he's saying to us, don't stop short. Know that he is able to save us completely. He is interceding to bring us completely in. He is seated in the throne room. Verse 13 says he's seated. Now, what's happening while he's seated? Why isn't he coming out? Right? We're eagerly waiting. That was the picture at the end of chapter 9. That he's like, just as the high priest made the sacrifice and goes in, and the people are eagerly waiting for the high priest to come out on the Day of Atonement. We eagerly await his return. What's happening while he's in there? Well, he's interceding, but it says in verse 13, he's waiting from then on until his enemies are made a footstool for his feet. Right? So here he points back to Psalm 110. He says he's in there, he's waiting. Well, what's the delay? This would have been an important understanding for the people at this time who are waiting and waiting. Further in this chapter, later on, he's going to talk about how, you guys, when you started believing, you knew like there was a hope. You had taken hold of this hope. And so you were suffering, and if you weren't suffering and you saw other people suffering, you went and joined in with them. And so because they knew that, hey, this is nothing. The stuff here, the possessions here, there's nothing. We have a better inheritance. They recognize that, but now they're growing weary. And so, in 2 Peter, he says, some of you are saying, what's the delay? What's the wait? Why is God so slow in keeping his promise? And Peter says, well, he's not slow as some of you consider slow, but he's patient with you, not wanting any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. So there's this delay. This waiting. He's waiting until his enemies are appointed as a footstool under his feet. So this is pointing back again to Psalm 110, which has been repeated since the first chapter, multiple occasions in chapter 1 and again in chapter 7. Psalm 110 was the Psalm of David saying, Adonai has made this declaration. It's a prophetic utterance to my Lord. Adonai, the Lord has said to my Lord, David says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Right? So the Adonai has uttered, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. So you have this enthronement imagery, right? You're seated and enthroned, and it's from that place that the enemies are made as to be under your feet. And so you have this picture of him as king, but of course Psalm 110 also points to him as priest. Right? It's later in Psalm 110 that to the same one that he says, sit here until I make your enemies a footstool under your feet, and he speaks of his scepter in verse 2, that he goes on to say, the Lord has spoken, the Lord has declared on oath, and he will not change his mind. The Lord has sworn it. You, the one seated forever, the one seated until his enemies are made a footstool under his feet. You are a priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek. We've gone through that. So the king is a forever priest, seated. So that we have this kind of priest. Again, verse 14, it says, for by a single offering. The opening word of verse 14 is one, single, in the feminine form, mia. It's a single offering. By a single offering, he has perfected, he has made complete forever those being made holy. So when he says he is perfected, it actually uses what's called the perfect tense. The Greek tense, that's the perfect tense, which the perfect tense describes an action that has been completed and yet its effects are still being felt. It's the action is completed, but it has ongoing impact. That's what the perfect tense would mean. It's not just a past tense, like it's done, like a aorist tense that says it's over. It says it was done, and its impact reverberates. It continues. That's sort of the idea of the perfect tense. And so it uses that tense here. He perfected, he made complete, like by his once one-time sacrifice. They have to do this over and over and over again. One time, he has perfected those who, and then it uses a present participle, those who are being made holy, right? So there's ongoing action, so that his impact, the impact of this once and for all, is making us holy, right? It is making us holy. He is interceding. We need to remember back in chapter 4 and in a couple of other places that I can't draw off the top of my head, he has said we need to have to maintain that zeal that we would enter into his rest. Like, don't grow weary. We need to be zealous. We're almost there. The good things that are about to come. So what he has done is done, and he is making us holy. We are being made holy. And now again, he points back to Jeremiah 31. Verse 15 here, it says, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, has also testifies to us. For after saying, this is the covenant that I will cut with them. After those days, says Adonai, I will put my Torah upon their hearts, and upon their minds I will write it. Then he says, I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. So he basically quotes from Jeremiah 31. He skips, he consolidates the house of Judah and the house of Israel into them. This is the covenant I will make with them. Which in Jeremiah 31, if we glance back, let's look. Jeremiah 31 says, this is the covenant, verses 32, I will make with the house of Israel after those days. And previously in verse 31, with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers when I brought them out of Egypt. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Adonai. I will put my Torah within them. Yes, I will write it on their heart. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Right? And then he continues, no longer will each teach his neighbor or each his brother, saying, know Adonai, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares Adonai. For I will forgive their iniquity, their sin I will remember no more. So he points back to Jeremiah 31. He says, this is what the new covenant, he says, the new covenant is coming. A new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. I'm going to make this covenant with them. And he says, I will remove their sins. I will remove their iniquities. I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. He paraphrases that. Now, verse 18 brings the point home. He says, now, where there's a removal of these, there's no longer an offering for sin. Right? So, in the circumstance with, if sin and iniquity have been removed, then you don't keep sacrificing. The reason that the priests keep sacrificing day after day, year after year, is because the blood of bulls and goats does not have the power to remove sin. If it did, he said in verse 2, they would stop, it would cease. So when sin is removed, which he said would happen in Jeremiah 31, and the writer of Hebrews says that's happened. His work affected that, and you are being made holy. That one-time sacrifice of the son of the great high priest in the order of Melchizedek, he didn't offer the blood of bulls or goats, that he lifted himself as an offering. That's the better sacrifice. That with that done, he doesn't have to do that over and over. It's done. Why would you go back to the model that can't get you anywhere? Why would you're gonna stand on a radio controlled car and think you're gonna get somewhere when he has given you the way to life? It's already done. Why would you go back here? When with sin, with with the sinful conscience, the sinful inner man having been made clean. And there's an established, he has done it, and yet there's this picture of it being done within us, that we are becoming. It's done, and yet we are becoming. Then going back to treat, and this is what he's going to deal with. We'll get into this probably at least Monday, but maybe Tuesday. You're going to treat his blood with the same way you would treat in common with this, with blood of bulls and goats. That's an insulting. That's insulting with what he has done. Don't do that. Don't do that. Be careful of what you're doing, he goes on to say later in chapter 10. But the point here is we're not going to go backward, right? That what he has done, it is finished. It is complete. So now we need to enter into his rest. Do not grow weary. And he's going to begin to talk about, we need to encourage one another. We need to exhort one another. We need to gather together every day like this. To say, don't fade away. Don't fade backward. Don't go away. We need to go forward. To be made to what is almost there. To inherit salvation. We're so close. And so don't go back to the old. Don't fade away. All right, well, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, shalom. Have a beautiful day.